Hello and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds anarchism, mutual aid, non-domination, and cooperation in your everyday life. I am your host, Graham Culbertson. In this quick intro, I just want to tell you that today I will be talking with my guest about pirates. Yes, pirates. Like anarchists, obvious villains, and perhaps also it's more complicated than that. After the music, Gabriel Kuhn, author of Life Under the Jolly Roger, Reflections on Golden Age Piracy, will be joining me. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is the long-awaited episode about pirates, and I am joined by an expert on the connection between piracy and anarchism. He even wrote a book about it, Gabriel Kuhn. Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Can you just start by telling us how you came to write a book about pirates?
Yeah, I can. It's a fairly interesting story, at least for myself. I'm not going to make it too long, but it started with me writing an essay about an essay about piracy, an essay using piracy as a background to developing radical theory that I felt was interesting when I was about 20 years old, I think, as a philosophy student. And I was at the time very much interested in French philosophy. So Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault. I'm much more critical now, but that's another story. So we're in the early 1990s. And I wanted to write something about this and express how their ideas entailed radical political visions. And to make that interesting to readers, I used the history of piracy as a background on which I tried to present those ideas. So it was sort of an experiment of a 20-year-old, and I sent the essay. It was supposed to be part of a collective book that I was doing with some other students. And so we sent a couple of essays to this publisher and then never really finished this collection, but the publisher had read what we had sent and wanted to bring out this particular essay on piracy as a little booklet. So this was in German. And so that appeared in 1991 or two or something. And I wasn't a historian of piracy, nothing like that. It came from somewhere else. I went traveling a few years later. I knew nothing about it. That essay was translated into English and published by Black Rose Books in Canada, together with another much longer German text on women pirates. And that was published as a book called Women Pirates and something else. I do not recall. Anyway, my essay was part of it. And I think that book was fairly popular in the 1990s. And now you fast forward to 2007-8, and PM Press gets founded as a new radical publisher in the US. And I knew the people who founded it, and they were looking for to build their catalog. So reaching out to authors they knew. And they got in touch with me and said, hey, didn't you write that essay about piracy? Don't you want to write a book about piracy? We think that would be interesting. Remember, too, that was a time when the Pirates of the Caribbean, the movie series with Johnny Depp was pretty popular. So I think it was both that they genuinely thought the topic was interesting, but I think there was also a thought that, that'd be a book that would sell, and it's good if you start up a new publisher to have a few topics that you think would attract readers. And so essentially they asked me, and I was, that was a long time ago. I wrote that essay, and I'm not really an expert as such on piracy, but this would give me an excuse to actually do some more proper studying, much more proper historical studying that I had done for that original essay. And so I took that time and worked on this book, Life Under the Jolly Roger.
Okay, it's so interesting that you talk about the trendiness of pirates. There is a new TV show about pirates that just came out, although I haven't seen it, from the same team that made Flight of the Conchords and What We Do in the Shadows. It could be that pirates are about to have another historical moment, and I'm fascinated. I mean, as you talk about this, one of the interesting things about pirates in at least American culture is that they like so many cultural forces seem to embody simultaneously our greatest fears and our greatest desires. So from one point of view, being a pirate is the worst thing imaginable and stands for death and theft and sexual violence. And on the other hand, and the creators of that new show, Our Flag Means Death, talked about this. There's this very romantic allure of the life of pirate as a life of freedom and discovery. I don't think there's any pirate narratives I can think of that are mainstream that go as far as like Robin Hood to like the pirates as heroes, but nevertheless, the fear and loathing of pirates and the love and romanticization of pirates are linked together in the same way that gunslingers in the Western myth are kind of to be admired and also feared. And you want to be one, but if you're a regular person, don't want to be in a town that is found by Vikings or pirates or gunslingers because they are terrifying at the same time. So this idea of like pirates, the worst thing one can be, and also our hidden dream, is something I hadn't really thought of. So let's I guess I'll just start there. Does that sense of pirates transfer into Europe? Do they fulfill this kind of romantic role in the same way?
I absolutely. I think that you just sort of captured the essence of the pirate image in Euro American culture. I dare to say that it even extends beyond that, but I don't feel as comfortable, saying that about other cultures. I know too little, but in Europe and America, that is North America, that is certainly the case. And I think what you're saying, I think it also, you could just say that this sort of double image of piracy reflects is a notion or two notions that most people also connect with freedom in general. So on the one hand, it opens up these enormous possibilities and you can do whatever you want. On the other hand, it is also terrifying because you're thrown out there into a world where all the regular forces, state, regular society, even the family, whatever, they kind of disappear. So what gives you security also disappears. So freedom is both very, very exciting and alluring, but also terrifying in a way. And I think pirates, and you mentioned some other examples, it's just that pirates for different reasons have gotten a very, very prominent status in this sort of, popular folklore history. They just represent that. So, and this goes, it's also interesting because this, like that image of both, that is both a very romantic image, but also a sort of, fearful image. I mean, you have that both in radical circles, but in just mainstream society. I mean, pirates are popular among political radicals, but they're also popular at any regular, what do you call it, like a custom party or wherever you're supposed to dress up. Like kids like to dress up as pirates, and so that attraction, pirate movies are very popular, so that attraction goes through all classes and all through society.
Yeah, I think one way to think of this is kind of a structuralist way of thinking of it, is like the pirate is the alluring but ultimately terrifying mirror image of society. So if you sometimes think, life is boring, we've reached the end of history with all of these, roads and laws and regulations, but everyone in the West gets to eat and go to college and everything. And of course, this is not true, but this is a very common, middle and upper class narrative in the West. Then wouldn't you like to, leave your family and go on an adventure. And that sounds wonderful. And then it's going to come with it danger and violence. And so one of the ways this narrative plays out is you're supposed to learn at the end that what you actually want is a bourgeois existence. Because if you gain freedom, freedom comes with it monstrous behavior by you or against you, and fear and terror. So in that respect, the pirate narrative is an explanation for why anarchism is wrong, for why radical thinking is wrong. Stay home, stay safe, be Bilbo Baggins in your little hobbit hole, and don't go messing around with stealing jewels and things like that, because it seems fun, but pretty soon it teaches you that's not the world you want to live in. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, if you look at, so what's the purpose of all these stories for mainstream society? It serves this double purpose. On the one hand, it allows you to go, to escape into these imaginary worlds of freedom, and you can you all these things that keep you, that restrict you in everyday life. You can leave that behind you, and so you watch the movies and you read the books, and you live in this fantasy world, so you can satisfy that need. But at the same time, there is also, as you say, very often at the end, the moral lesson that you shouldn't really go there because it's not going to turn out well. So it satisfies this need on the one hand, but it also keeps you in place where you're at in real life. So it really, you could say, I mean, largely has a sort of pacifying function for most people. I think then the interesting thing from the radical perspective is, does it have to be that way, or could you also approach that narrative and actually draw some inspiration out of it for radical action, rather than just being happy that you've had this little secret imaginary journey, but now you're safe back in your everyday life, and that's how it's supposed to be. So I think that would be sort of the challenge for a radical both interpretation and adaptation maybe of pirate tales. But for most people, I mean, what you described, I think, is the mainstream function of pirate folklore. Yes.
Okay, I want to come back to that idea of radical action, but now I want to venture into this world in which I am truly ignorant. So in what sense were pirates actually radical actors or anarchists? Knowing, as you know, I have a very broad definition of anarchism on this show, but in what sense did it represent freedom, community, perhaps a form of racial egalitarianism? When we're thinking about historical pirates, and of course, as an American, especially as an American I live in North Carolina, which was one of the great pirate hotbeds, is where Blackbeard met his end. So we're thinking, for Americans at least, it's that golden age of piracy in the Caribbean and the Southeast. So is there truth to this sense in radical circles that the pirates did offer in some ways a true alternative to the imperialism and colonialism of that time?
So in some ways they did. Let me say something real quick before I get there about the Golden Age, because this is really it is actually called the Golden Age of piracy. So we're talking the late 17th century to about 1725, very much centered in the Caribbean, and then venturing into the Indian Ocean around Madagascar and on the west coast of Africa. And why I call it the Golden Age of piracy is because that is the period that has given us all of the images that we, when we just speak of pirates, sort of associate with those communities. So the pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, and the peg legs, and the parrot on your shoulder. And I mean, some of that also throughout history, of course, has been exaggerated, but this is where that comes from. Because in the broader sense, if you, for example, just identify piracy with, let's say, sea robbery, that's sort of a different phenomenon, because people have been robbing other people on sea for a long time in a lot of places, and purpose is always sort of different. But what's special about this so-called Golden Age is that you, in fact, do have communities that do not have a land base and are often integrated into a community there, or that who do not, as it also happened in the Caribbean before the Golden Age, are sort of more or less mercenaries who prey on ships, trading ships of other nations, not as official soldiers, but as what they would call privateers, as basically state-sanctioned pirates that were used in a trade war. So what you have during the Golden Age are communities that have really that are under no protection of no state, that are a nuisance to everyone, that are in that sense lawless and stateless, and really sort of based on themselves and making their own rules. And there we're already getting to this point of the question, how anarchic or anarchistic were those communities? I mean, if you just define anarchism, as it often happens, even though it might be a vulgar definition, as being anti-statist or something that's out of the control of the state, then yes, I mean those were anarchic communities in that sense. Or an example for anarchism or anarchy is the question. If sometimes people, when you speak of anarchism, they want to see some kind of ideological element there. That was absent. I mean, there was no great political theory behind that. So let's stick to the term anarchy, maybe, and anarchic communities. If you associate with anarchic or anarchist communities, if the ideology comes in, communities that are not just outside of state control, but that are also, as you say, egalitarian, based on mutual aid and solidarity, you see certain parts in those pirate communities that correspond to these notions, and then others that don't. So I think it's a mixed bag. So also, I mean, relative to their time, they were certainly more egalitarian than the Euro-American societies where most of those pirates originated from. So, for example, I mean, they signed the pirate communities when they were founded. Some of those documents were available to historians, or are still available. So they basically signed rules of conduct that, for example, stipulated how the booty would be divided, and it was fairly egalitarian. I mean, you had the captain and the quartermaster, and they'd get more, but it might be a double share, whatever. It's not like the capitalist who gets 50 times as much as the workers do, or so the strong hierarchies that were characteristic of Euro-American societies at the time weren't as pronounced in pirate societies, but they existed. You mentioned racial equality. There are different, all sorts of indications that there was racism in pirate communities, but there are also indications that it was indeed easier for non-white people to become at least relative egalitarian crew members. So, I mean, they were, they were not as slaves on the ship. I mean, there were some examples where pirates were involved in the slave trade, but very often also people of African descent or Native American descent would become regular crew members. So relative to their time, yes, there were progressive notions in pirate communities, but nothing really indicates that they were prime examples of what we today sort of envision as egalitarian anarchist communities with no leaders and consensus decision making, or whatever your associations are. So the short answer is yes, some no.
Okay, there's so much here that I want to talk about this a little bit longer. So the first thing, in terms of there not being anarchism, in terms of a theory of how and why anarchy and an anarchic community is the right way to live. Again, as you know, Gabriel, because we've talked some, Kropotkin is very important to me as a thinker, and he certainly argues that anarchism is not necessary for an anarchic community, that in so many ways anarchism is a natural, even evolutionarily like required state of being in humanity, and it really takes a lot of work and effort to create what, the kind of civilizations that we know now with all of these hierarchic structures. In that sense, it seems to me that the pirate communities are a great example of not of anarchism, not of the theory of anarchism, but hey, if you strip all this away, you're not going to get some sort of really well reasoned commune, like it was drawn up by Proudhon or Bakunin or something, but you are going to get this, you could say, natural or organic form of organization, because it's just simply obvious that the captain shouldn't get 50% of the loot. And I hesitate to go too far with things like obvious and organic and natural, but it seems like this is a good test study for how anarchism is a sort of, Graeber and Wingrove argue this in their new book also, anarchism, or not anarchism, anarchy with these certain freedoms and these certain forms of mutual aid is the sort of default of humanity. And it actually takes a great deal of work and time for elites to create this hierarchical structure. So we cannot look to them and say, oh, look, they created this commune, we should create a commune like that. But we can look to them and say, hey, if you remove sailors from the Navy, they actually will still be able to sail ships, will still be able to fight, but without so many of the hierarchical things that the Navy assumes are necessary to sailing a ship and fighting a war. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, very, very, I mean, you allude to a very, very concrete example. I mean, a lot of the pirates came from Navy ships, and one of the motivations, and sure, I mean, there was, rob other ships and you might get money more easily, or people, I guess, were dreaming of really hitting it big and getting a lot of money and being able to retire, as some pirates actually were able to do. So all of that certainly played into it, but I think, and I mean, we can only really speculate because there are so few documents, but a major motivation for a lot of these people to join these pirate communities was that they were coming from communities where circumstances where life wasn't exactly a lot of fun, either as soldiers on Navy ships or as sailors on merchant ships with a very harsh regime. And so these pirate communities offered a possibility, or offered an opportunity of living in what really was relative equality and also relative democracy. I mean, one thing about pirate captains, for example, is that, so even if they got a little bit of a higher share of the booty, they also had certain responsibilities. So it was expected that in times of economic crisis, there wasn't a ship to rob for a while, and people, the crew, the resources were running short, since the captains had been able to accumulate more reserves because of the extra share they got in the booty. They were then also expected to share that among the crew. So there was a certain, almost like an insurance function involved in that. And plus, pirate captains who didn't do their job properly were quite easily, I mean, that was partly also, again, stipulated in those rules of conduct. I mean, they could basically be voted out of office. So of course, I mean, you looked at those communities and you'd be like, okay, I can be a part of this, rather than, working 18-hour days on the merchant ship under the sort of harsh regime of sadistic over foreman. That was an attraction. I think that's one of the reasons why many joined, knowing that this might entail a very short life, but it was still more attractive than a perhaps longer life under the circumstances they came from.
Yeah, so that was the other thing I wanted to talk about is the Navy, especially the British Navy, because I'm guessing, especially if you've seen some of the more romantic depictions, the Horatio Hornblower, all that stuff, it's hard for us to understand if you haven't studied this period. I don't know anything about pirates. I do know a lot about the British Navy, how horrific it was to be in the British Navy. The first thing to say is it was most of the time a form of slavery. People were either impressed, which is the thing that America fought the War of 1812 over, which is to say that British citizens who were on one of these merchant ships could just be pressed into action. A ship could sail up, stop that merchant ship, take people off of it, and force them to work. I mean, it was a form of enslavement. You got paid, but you talk about short life. A lot of them died before they ever got paid. So if you're thinking, oh, pirates, they're terrible, they're violent, they just sail up to ships and take slaves. Well, they didn't always take slaves. Sometimes they took new comrades, but the British ships pretty much always did take slaves. If you want to talk about pirates are violent, no one is more violent than the army, and the British Navy is as violent as possible. And especially, you're talking about these pirate codes, and listeners, I'll put a link. I think just Wikipedia has a page that has like most of the extant pirate codes in English. If you read the British Navy regulations, they are so much harsher and more violent. Leaving aside the fact that there's so much more hierarchy, and the captain, I do think the captain gets half of the prize money. It might be a quarter, but far more. The British Navy captain gets far more than the pirate captain. So sure, hierarchy is still existing, but the British Navy captain cannot be voted out, as you say. But the other thing is the British Navy captain is putting people to death all the time. It's like a weekly duty to put someone to death on a large enough ship. So in 2022, you think, oh, pirates, they're bad, they're violent, they murder, they steal. Sure. But compared to the British Navy, they are much less violent. I think they do less murder, and they do a lot less theft. I mean, the Navy's job, whether they're privateers in trade wars or if there's an actual war, the key Navy job is to capture merchant ships, take men off them, impress them as sailors. I would call that slavery, and steal the wealth. So pirates are doing exactly what the states are doing, definitely doing it less brutally. And then the problem now is that we have, I think it's less popular these days, the Horatio Hornblower and the Patrick O'Brien Master and Commander series of these noble British Navy ships. And I must admit, I enjoy them very much. But they really are, if you think the pirate stories are romanticized, the idea of the British Navy sailing around the world and liberating people and striking blows for liberty, that is a form of romanticization that is far worse than the pirates. And when you put it, not just, you've been saying, Gabriel, put it in their context of their time. Yes, their time, but put it in the context of the other armed sailing organizations, and I don't think you will find anything that compares to the British Navy in the record of the pirates. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an easy, a simple calculation, especially if you put the context of both, and it was a package, if you will, the British or also other European Navy forces and the merchants. And look at, also the context in which this golden age of piracy emerged. I mean, it was in the triangle trade between Europe, the Americas, and Africa. And that was part of an imperialist enterprise that you could argue was based 100% on plunder. That's what it really was about. You were stealing things. And so the pirates took a tiny fraction out of the plunder into their own pockets. And so, in that sense, if you do the math, yes, that was far less brutal or inflicting on anybody than what the merchants and the armies, navies of the states did. And so in that is a very important aspect in general. If you look at the history of piracy, especially of the Golden Age, that it really was a phenomenon that came out of the imperialist era, and in some ways, again, also in racial attitudes, for example, did reflect that. I mean, it's not that someone being brought up in the British Navy, the second they transfer to a pirate ship, their entire view of the world or everything they've grown up with and been taught disappears. But they certainly entered a world where a lot of that was put into question. There were different perspectives, and again, it certainly was relatively way more progressive and liberating for pretty much anyone who entered.
Yeah, thank you for making that point, which I think in talking about the Navy, I missed this key thing, which is that these navies existed in order to enslave and steal. That was the whole point. So the narrative that pirates are bad because they enslave and steal. One of my neighbors says, you're not a criminal if you have an army. It's the same thing. As long as you can have a hereditary monarch sign a piece of paper, you're not a pirate anymore. And those are the famous privateers that you mentioned. And from an anarchist perspective, that doesn't hold up very well, does it? Oh, this form of slavery and violence and rape is fine because the government signed off on it. That is, and so pirates. And the other thing is, you're right. There's in terms of some tiny bit of plunder. Obviously, the average victim of a pirate is just going to be another person, someone who might even be indentured or enslaved. But the people whose pocketbook are being hurt are the aristocrats, the merchant adventurers, the big companies. I mean, it is a robbing from the rich situation. That's not to excuse or fail to acknowledge the violence of piracy, but it does seem they come out better in almost every way compared to the British government. It was piracy. It was piracy in India, and it was piracy in Africa, and it was piracy in South America. That's just piracy. At least the pirates called themselves pirates. I don't think the British monarchs acknowledged their villainy at all. In fact, I think they built monuments to themselves.
Yeah, that's certainly right.
Okay. So something else I'm going to need to cover at some point, a tradition I don't know as well, but there's definitely an Italian tradition of brigands, which seem to be kind of land pirates who have been probably treated the same way, far less romanticized than pirates, but they seem to have a similar thing. But I won't call on you to talk about brigands. I'll just say for the listener, brigands will come up at some point, and I think Italy is the place. Partisans and brigands get sort of blended together. There's go ahead.
No, there is. I just want to say, I mean, for people interested in that, and I write about that partly in the book. I mean, if you look at Eric Hobsbawm's, for example, writing about social rebels, and he focuses a lot on bandits, and
yes,
there are very clear structural similarities to the role that pirates played, both in their actual the way they interfered with basically capitalist expansion in their territories. The difference there is, here we speak of certain territories on land, and with the pirates, it's territories on the seas. But also then in terms of again, the folklore and the role that these people played in people's imagination, and how, especially for the poorer parts of society, they did serve, romanticized or not, but they did serve as an inspiration for rebellion against authorities, and there are very clear similarities there.
Excellent. The next thing I was going to talk about is go back to talking about radical inspiration in present day. Before that, though, I don't know if this is something you can speak to. There was, a new golden age or a new peak of piracy, in the Indian Ocean, centered around Somalia. And I think that was also another time where people there was this very easy narrative, which is, true in a certain way, like Putin is bad, the pirates are bad, and they were killing people. But then there's a much deeper narrative that the piracy that emerged coming out of Somalia was the product of a country that had been destroyed, of a broken society, and a society that was broken, as is the case with most broken societies in the world, by forms of Western imperialism and neoliberalism. So I guess one thing, I don't know if you have expertise about this, but just the thoughts of pirates do still exist, and they are still like real pirates, like African pirates in the 21st century. I don't think they get romanticized. I think they're pretty purely vilified. There was that movie Captain Phillips, which at least offered a humane portrait of its primary pirate character. But I would just say, and you can say if you have anything to add to this, that when you're hearing about pirates and bandits today, these things do still exist. You can try and think about them in the same way that we're thinking about these golden age pirates, not to celebrate their violence, but think of them as the product of this larger system, which has violence and villainy at the heart of it, just done by parliaments and governments. Does that? I don't know. I just came up with
No,
that.
no, I mean that's perfectly right. If you look at, I mean, a lot of the pirates off the Somali coast called themselves the Somali Coast Guard, essentially, and so the reason is so one thing, as you say, I mean, the sort of social, political, historical background to that is a country that was broken because of, at least among other things, foreign intervention, and so there is that background that you create a social situation where people become essentially desperate enough to employ means such as piracy. But also in the Somali case, I mean, there's a lot. It's about fishing rates. It's about dumping toxic waste off the coast of Somalia because the state is broken and there is no functioning coast guard that will prevent foreign powers from doing that. And all of this plays into it. So there's a lot of similar things now, because I mean the Somali piracy has largely disappeared in the last few years because of better surveillance and again, modern Navy ships that patrol those areas. But we also piracy off the coast of Nigeria, which is a lot related to the oil industry there. And again, it's the same patterns. It's people without power who look for both economic opportunity, that's always a factor, but also a different, for them probably more dignified form of life in rebellion to the powers, foreign powers often in their areas. So you have that. The big difference, because I've been asked that question a lot about the Somali pirates when the book came out.
I thought I had come up with such a good question, but so
sorry. No, it is a good question, and it's an obvious question, but especially when the book came out, that was when the Somali piracy was at its height. The big difference, which is the big difference between the Golden Age pirates and most other pirates in human history, is that also the Somali pirates are, in a sense, as I said, more sea robbers. So those people, they don't have their own maritime communities far away from any community on land or any state. I mean, those are people who happen to live in coastal areas, have experience as fishermen or in sailing for other reasons. Maybe they've worked even on bigger trade ships before. And so the most obvious way, if they want to go, quote unquote, the criminal route, is to look to the sea and see what they can rob there. If they were in different areas in the mountains of Italy, then they become, bandits there or robbers or so. So what you're missing is this element of being an exclusive, sort of self-contained community that the Golden Age pirates on their ships were, where their ships really were their homes. I mean, they had safe havens around the Caribbean, where then in Madagascar or West Africa, where they could sail to, but that was, to spend a few days on land. Their home really were the ships. So you don't have that in Somalia. You don't have that in Nigeria. There's also a famous period of piracy in the Mediterranean in Europe, which even preceded the Golden Age of piracy. But it was the same thing. It was people living on the coast of North Africa, and they were getting on their boats, sailing out for a few days and doing sea robbery, piracy in that sense. But there's a big difference. Also, the question, for example, if you started to look at, okay, so what do these communities, pirate communities in Somalia look like, and what are their codes of? It's very different because, again, I mean, in their everyday lives, they're just part of the wider coastal Somali community and sort of abide to the social rules that exist there. So that is the big difference. But in terms of, what is the motivation for the, again, quote unquote, criminal acts, that's very similar to what happened in the Golden Age.
Fantastic. Thanks for that clarification. I was thinking, as you talked about this, so one of the most famous, if not the most famous work of American literature is this book Moby Dick, and it really does talk about the way that the ship and is a world, is a community in and of itself. And that is part of the reason why there's so much glamour about the era of tall ships, because you are outside of the all of the societies that currently exist. So it makes complete sense that that's how the golden age of pirates were able to create a sort of communal way of being, because a ship requires that, and then that communal way of being has to be enforced in a fairly hierarchical or a less hierarchical way. And Somali pirates who will take a relatively small ship, maybe even a boat, off the coast for a brief amount of time, and maybe there's only 5 of them. That, I mean, this option no longer exists in this world, to be so cut off without a enormous deliberate attempt to live off the grid or something like that. So,
which also I think ties into this sort of strong image of especially golden age piracy and the freedom part, because as you say, this has become like this, satellite communication, all of that. Like it's no longer feasible in that sense. But at the time, you really had. I mean, you were out on those boats. No one really knew who you were. Like the Navy, had to. I mean, it was difficult. The ocean is big, to even just track those ships down at the time. That was a big effort. Kind of like a cat and mouse game. Even along the coast of North Carolina, for example. I mean, it wasn't. You had to maneuver the ships for a long time to then find the hideouts and. So yeah, and I think that all plays into it. There was at the times offered an option of freedom that in that sense no longer even exists.
Yeah, I mean, Melville himself, I talked about this fantasy, this middle class person who goes and gets on a boat. Melville himself was a downwardly mobile upper class person who had entered the middle class and just got sick of it and went to get on a whaling ship to have this experience. So it wasn't piracy, but it was the same idea. And whaling and piracy were always connected. All right, so we've entered. I took us back to the 19th century, which is my area of expertise, but we've entered the 21st century. So let's talk about pirate parties. I mentioned to you earlier that there's this thing in Europe called pirate parties, or at least there were 15 or 20 years ago. And I remember when they popped up in America, we had no idea what to do with them. Certainly, Germany was the place that they were most talked about. So, can we start with pirate parties? Can you tell us what pirate parties are for those of us who don't have much of a grasp? And then from there, we can go to some other ways of thinking about pirates in terms of radical action.
Yeah, the pirate parties emerged essentially out of a discussion about copyright and the internet. That was really what it was, and that was turned into let's say sort of a civil rights type question, where it was that this is the question of the commons also. So this is something that has been created by people for the people, and it shouldn't be regulated. But also a question of personal freedom. Like you should be able to use this without being tracked and traced and surveyed and all of that. And so in that sense, it started out as you could say they were single issue parties in that sense. But then, as it always is the case, even at the time, I mean, there was a sort of sense of political crisis, which is a long-going, political crisis, really, and also the legitimation, I guess, of European democracy. So that plays into it. A big frustration with the political establishment and all of that. So very quickly, there was this sort of protest party image attached to the pirate parties, and that image gets passed on from different nowadays. For example, that in Europe, there are in several countries they're fairly successful. COVID sort of, what's the right word? It's all become so sensitive. People who are critical of the vaccinations,
COVID resistance parties.
COVID resist. That's call them COVID resistance parties. So they pop up, and I guess they, partly now tap into the potential protest voters, as they're called. And so you have those different periods. And when the pirate parties emerged 10, 15 years ago, they certainly tapped into that sort of demographic, people who otherwise maybe wouldn't vote, or who, kind of change their votes every time. And so there was a new party to vote for. So it was a combination, I think, of that, and it was fairly successful, as you said. In Germany, they entered. I think in Berlin, they were in the city parliament. There were representatives voted into the European Parliament from different countries, among them Sweden, where I live, which has a pretty strong, the so-called Pirate Bay, which some of your listeners might have heard of.
Yeah, I'm sure they're familiar with Pirate Bay.
Comes from Sweden. And so they were fairly successful here. But then, as it is also often the case with these parties, even though they can have quick, fairly big success, there usually isn't, there certainly isn't an organizational infrastructure behind them that would have, grown through the centuries, as it happened with other big political parties. Sometimes there's a problem of funding. There is a problem of then having people involved with very little political experience, so infighting happens. So nowadays, I can't think of a single. I think there are some now, sort of delayed. I think in some Eastern European countries, pirate parties still have electoral success, but in most countries, no longer really. So it's a phenomenon that sort of had an influence on politics in Europe for a few years, but it's kind of on the way out. I think partly also because if you go back to the single issue aspect. More parties, other parties have developed their own policies on the internet and copyright and whatnot. But you could also argue that big business and big tech has won that battle in a sense. They now certainly control the internet, and this sort of organized resistance that the pirate parties in a sense also represented weren't really able to stop that. And as it often is, I think then people, even if they're still fed up with that development, sort of look more for individual solutions to that. You get your whatever, you find your, what are these things called, VPNs or something, where you hide your identity on the computer, and so that those become the solutions rather than an organized sort of resistance that those parties maybe promised to offer. So we're looking, but let's tie it. So why pirate parties? I think that is in a sense interesting, because I think that, it's no coincidence that they were using that name, right? Because even historically, as we're talking with related to freedom and trying to escape a web of constant surveillance and being under permanent control, I think that's what that sort of alludes to. That no, there should be. And in this case, then it becomes the virtual space of the internet. There should be freedom to move. There should be freedom to do things out there that aren't, not every step should be controlled. And this is something that, I guess, again, pirate folklore or pirate imaginary, where that's something that the pirates stand for. And so it'd be used. I think it's similar in terms like pirate radio, for example. Why is that called pirate radio? It's basically because you want to do a radio that, doesn't get detected, is not controlled, or they uses that free space that is out there that the pirate did, which is, as we said before, is becoming smaller and smaller, but you're still trying to find your niches. And so in these contexts, the term pirates or piracy still pops up, and I think that's legitimate. This is not, it's nothing that you just pull out of thin air. There is a sort of a historical justification to using that term. So I think that's all fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think when you think about the piracy, the golden era of the 90s and the early 2000s, the Napster and torrent era of pirated music. I mean, certainly there's still plenty of pirated music and movies, but it does seem like there's not as much piracy as there was in 1999. That too had that sense of like, this piracy is going to destroy this industry. It's antisocial. The government is going to crack down on it. On the other hand,
I mean, just to throw that in, because we mentioned the Pirate Bay, I mean, those folks, they were put on trial and they got their sentences. And so there certainly was repression as an answer to that.
and there's also, but there was also this sense of freedom, and you get the EFF in America. I mean, it is interesting, probably because of parliamentary reasons. The people who do this work my cat joined us.
That's fine.
The people who do that,
they're allowed to have an interest in piracy too.
Yes, cats are the original pirates. Plus, they were on all the ships. My cat is actually a Manx cat, which was a kind of cat that originated on the Isle of Man, but was so effective at killing rats that it traveled all over the world on ships, including pirate ships. So that's how I'm going to tie it. Like, this cat's ancestors probably served on pirate ships. Honestly, certainly served on Navy ships, without a doubt.
There you go.
Okay, so I was going to say, we don't get governmental angle, but our government, it's so much harder to start a small party and get anyone elected to anything in the United States. So when you get advocates for piracy and electronic freedom, you get it from some activists and then professors and academics who, the professors are one of the very, very few groups of people who have sort of time and space to resist the status quo while also living a comfortable life, at least in the United States. There's the cat again. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about before we go is, so obviously listeners of this podcast are familiar with St. Pauli and the pirate.
Oh yeah, you had a program, yes.
I did. So in what sense, beyond the pirate parties, in what sense can the pirates be it's sometimes called a usable past, something we can look back to in the anarchist and the radical communities, or are there people doing this work right now besides the Jolly Roger for the football club in Hamburg?
Right. Well, I think that, I mean, the reason why it's become a symbol for St. Pauli, of course, is a combination of the club sort of being a rebel club and trying to portray itself as a rebel club, which is fine, and Hamburg having its own pirate tradition around people like Störtebeker and others, again, preceding the Golden Age. So it sort of, fits into this, both the social, political, and historical context. But I think also what the St. Pauli example shows, and again, I think it's similar to what I said about the pirate parties. Like, you use the pirate images in a context that is anti-authoritarian, rebellious, trying to offer at least glimpses of a different way of organizing society, in then that an anarchist, or if you want leftist context, that would be more egalitarian and based on mutual aid and solidarity rather than competition and all of that. And so I think that's why the pirate flag and pirate symbolism still pops up in those contexts. Squats, for example, very often would use it. And again, it makes sense. You liberate space. You try to build your own autonomous community, self-managed community. And I mean, it's difficult to start arguing about who is allowed to use that symbol and who is not. I mean, it's out there. People, will use it in whatever way they want to. I mean, images very similar to the Jolly Roger have been used in terrible political contexts, right-wing, racist, and so on. So you cannot control that. But when it is more explicitly referring back to this golden age of piracy, I think it mainly refers to a notion of different liberatory, again, more egalitarian, sort of anti-authoritarian, rebellious communities. And I mean, that is something that those sorts of rebellions will go on forever. And as long as the pirate imaginary is as strong as it is, and the folklore, those symbols will pop up. And I mean, I'm all in. I don't know. I'm in support of that. I understand why it happens, and I think there is no reason to object to that. It's an easy, clear message to a lot of people. Then you always have to dig deeper and look at the politics that are behind it. But there's a clear historical trajectory there that does connect the pirate communities of the Golden Age, preceding phenomena, current phenomena, and if you have your symbols and tales that tie this together, it's all good.
Oh, that sounds great. It is true. There was definitely both the people I talked to about São Paulo, there was some anxiety or concern about whether the pirate imagery had become more important than the actual values of the club. I can tell you, in the United States, there's no one who supports São Paulo because it has pirate imagery and then doesn't know about the other elements. Perhaps if it becomes a Erste Bundesliga club and is playing
Right.
Bayern, you might get kids who have a pirate shirt just because it's a pirate shirt. But you got to dig deep to find São Paulo right now
Right.
in America. The other thing that's just so obvious to me that I can't believe I didn't think of is you're right, squatting. Squatting is the place in terms of this. It's outside of the rules, but it's also the product of the rules and the product of the way the rules and the hierarchy and the economics have oppressed people. And then it's a place where you can, that image I was talking about from Melville of this community that is connected to the rest of society, but also at the same way cut off and doing its own thing. It seems to me that the squatters and the various autonomous communities, it makes sense that the pirate legacy is alive there. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for all you've been so helpful in terms of helping me with the podcast. So thank you for that as well. It's been a pleasure getting to know you over email, and it's wonderful to finally talk to you.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. Great pleasure for me. And sure, if there is, if I can help with other great episodes, always happy to.
You've been so much help. Thank you, Gabriel. There you have it. Pirates, anarchic. At least compared to the merchant ships, the slave ships, and the navy ships that were carrying on legal imperial piracy. Just another way that it seems to me that maybe the anarchists have been right all along and I am just catching up. Remember that you can email me at everydayanarchismpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments. And you can find much more at everydayanarchism.com. That's also where you can make a financial contribution to the show if you want to help keep the show going. Even if you can't give, I would love to receive an email from you, and you can still help the show. Tell a friend, that's the best thing you can do, but of course the algorithm would love it if you leave a review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify. All that's left to say is that the music, which you're about to hear, is by David Hill.